In this video, we're going to look at the first presidents and the precedents they set. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the challenges we face when we're the first people to try something new. We all face challenges every day, and challenges are presented to us in many different forms. For example, just recently, the entire world watched as Oscar Pistorius became the first double amputee to compete in the Summer Olympics. He didn't win a medal, but nobody will soon forget the challenges he overcame. The less serious challenge, but still pretty impressive, was when the devil challenged Homer Simpson to eat all the donuts in the world. Homer gladly accepted the challenge, and he succeeded. But of course, we're not always successful at overcoming challenges. By the way, that's not Captain Bun Buns. And there are some challenges that should just never be accepted. So what challenges does the first person to do something new face? Let's look at two quick examples. In 1870, in the face of widespread racism across the South after the Civil War, Hiram Revels became the first African American to serve in Congress. Since his election, 123 other African Americans have also served in Congress. About 100 years later, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. In the 5 years after his achievement, 11 other men walked on the moon as well. Both Revels and Armstrong led by example, or we could say they both set a precedent. So, what's a precedent? A precedent is something done or said that can be used as a model or an example to be followed in the future. Let's take a look at two important precedents that we've already learned about this year. The settlers at Jamestown set a precedent when they established the first colony in 1607. Some of the colonies that were settled after Jamestown followed their example by establishing a representative government, growing cash crops, and unfortunately, using African slaves. We also learned what not to do from Jamestown. We learned not to build your fort in the middle of a swamp where you can catch malaria or dysentery. You know, catching dysentery puts a whole new spin on this challenge, doesn't it? I think I'd have to say no to that one. Another precedent was set by the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States. Now hopefully you're asking yourself, wait a minute, didn't we just learn that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention got rid of the Articles because they were too weak and replaced them with the U.S. Constitution? How can the Articles be a precedent if we got rid of them? That's a good question. During the Civil War, the Confederate States, highlighted here in red, will write their own constitution that will closely resemble the Articles of Confederation instead of the U.S. Constitution. In that way, the Articles serve as a precedent. So let's get back to what this video is supposed to be about. What about the first presidents? What challenges did they face? And what precedents did they set? For the remainder of this video, we're going to look at 5 precedents set by the first presidents. Now, many of the president's powers are listed in Article 2 of the Constitution, such as his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, his power to veto laws, and his power to appoint ambassadors and judges. Actually, one of these 3 powers is not in Article 2. Be the first to tell me which one it is, and in which article you can find it in, and get some extra credit. As the first president, George Washington realized that there weren't always armed forces to command, laws to veto, or judges to appoint. But he soon found out there were plenty of other things to worry about as the chief executive. How was he supposed to handle the economy and the huge debt left over from the American Revolution? What was to be the relationship between the United States and other countries like Great Britain and France? How was the United States supposed to protect itself against foreign invasion? And what was to be the relationship between the president and the other 2 branches of government? These worries led Washington to his first precedent, the President's Cabinet. A cabinet is a group of advisors to the president. Why would establishing such a cabinet be a precedent? There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president has to do this, but every president since has followed Washington's example. Washington appointed 3 men to his cabinet to deal with his main areas of concern. He appointed Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury to deal with the economy. Thomas Jefferson served as Secretary of the State and dealt with our relationship with foreign nations. Henry Knox served as Secretary of War and handled the defense of the United States. Presidents' cabinets have grown over the years, and today there are 15 cabinet positions in the executive branch. The second precedent we are going to look at is the beginning of political parties in the United States. Now, even though Washington was president, he did not create the first 2 political parties. Like many founding fathers, he was suspicious of political parties. Political parties aren't even included in the Constitution. Most of the founders believed that political parties would lead to a bunch of needless arguing. Such arguing soon broke out, however, between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who, if you'll remember from just a couple of minutes ago, are 2 of Washington's most important advisors in his cabinet. The arguing between these 2 men over which direction the country should take led to the creation of the first 2 parties. Thomas Jefferson founded the Democratic-Republican Party, and Alexander Hamilton founded the Federalist Party. So, how did these 2 political parties set a precedent? Well, ever since they were created, the United States has had a 2-party system. Today we have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And, like Jefferson and Hamilton, the leaders of these parties still argue. Our third precedent is the idea of civic virtue. Now, we could go back to the dictionary and look up the definition of civic virtue, but George Washington provides us the perfect example of how this idea works. Civic virtue means putting the needs of the nation before your own interests. Washington's done this once before. After he defeated the British in the American Revolution, he could have had anything he wanted: power, money, you name it. Instead, he turned it all down and said, "Nope, I did it for my country. I just want to go home to my farm." When he did this, George III of Great Britain reportedly said, "If he does that, then he is the greatest man in the world." When Washington became the first president of the United States, he once again became the model of civic virtue. Washington is the only president to receive all of the electoral votes, and he did it twice. He could have easily run for a 3rd term and won, but he decided not to. He had held power long enough. It was time for someone else to take it. So, why is serving only 2 terms as president a precedent? Because for about 140 years, presidents refused to run for a 3rd term. When one finally did and won, the Constitution was amended to limit future presidents to Washington's example. Our 4th precedent is adding territory to the United States. Before 1803, the western boundary of the United States was at the Mississippi River. But in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States when he purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. So how is adding territory a precedent? Well, over the next 50 years, more territories would be added to the United States, establishing our current boundaries. Territories like Florida, Texas, the Oregon Country, and the Mexican Cession. Our 5th and final precedent is called judicial review. In 1801, President John Adams appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall held the post until 1835. In one of his most famous decisions, Marshall said, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is." The case was called Marbury v. Madison in 1803. The idea is judicial review. Judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional, which means it goes against something that's in the Constitution. So why is the establishment of judicial review a precedent? Judicial review cannot be found in the Constitution, but ever since Marshall used it, it's become the Supreme Court's most important power. For example, in 1954, the Supreme Court used its power of judicial review to declare school segregation unconstitutional. which meant it was against the law to force children of different races to attend different schools. Judicial review is also a great example of how checks and balances works. Judicial review allows the Supreme Court to limit both the power of the legislative and executive branches by declaring their actions unconstitutional. So those are our 5 precedents: the cabinet, political parties, civic virtue, adding territory, and judicial review. We'll take a closer look at some of these in class. Let's talk some more extra credit. Every year, the President delivers what's called his State of the Union address. He goes before Congress and basically says, hey, this is the condition our country is in, and this is what I'd like to do about it over the next year. Today, presidents do this on live TV so the whole country can watch, but of course, Washington couldn't do that. Washington had to deliver his as a written speech. Washington had no formal education, so even though he had some good ideas, he was uncomfortable about writing them down. So we found someone who was highly educated and a good writer and had him write the speech. The speech was delivered and read to Congress, and most members of Congress thought it was pretty good. In fact, they thought it was so good they figured we better write some kind of response to this to let Washington know that we heard him and understand his ideas. So they also found a good writer to write down their speech. Happened to be the same guy that Washington got. So this guy wrote the first State of the Union address, and he wrote the first response to the State of the Union address. If you can find out and tell me who this person is and be the first person from each class on both teams, you'll get the extra credit. Good luck.